Last week we began Daniel chapter 3, and the first verse we spent some time looking at idolatry and polytheism, etc., because the king Nebuchadnezzar has built a statue, basically what we would call a statue. Now today we want to go from there and look at what took place. So Daniel 3, verse 2 beginning. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent together to gather together the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now we remember that they're in the a place called Dura, where this statue has been built or placed, whichever the case may be. And we don't know exactly where that place is, but he's sent out a command for all of his officials to come to this place, and they all obey. The officials of every rank and of every province in his kingdom. Notice that. This is a huge gathering that takes place, and it takes place from great distances. I was interested to notice that some of our brethren, Zaire is one of them, have advocated that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not present at this gathering, and I've wondered how could they think that? Because how, if they weren't at the actual place, how could the Chaldeans know that they had not bowed to the thing? If you can figure out that puzzle, I'd like to hear what you have to say, but I don't understand how they could even begin to imagine that. But we're going to see that one very high official was not there. We know that for a fact, and I'll show you how we know it. It's known that Daniel, he wasn't there. Now, how can I say that? Well, when the Chaldeans are tattletales to Nebuchadnezzar, notice who they brought before him. And Daniel wasn't among that. We don't know why Daniel wasn't there. We're not given any indication. We have no historical evidence to show us. We have nothing. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he was on a very special mission for the king and could not come back for this event. But if he had been there, he would have been thrown into the furnace just like these three young men were. And this would have been, again, a very large gathering of officials. These are the officials of the kingdom. And notice when you read that list, it goes down even to the sheriffs. So this is very important. He's making a very, very big deal out of all this. And we realize and understand that in those times, it's not like today. We could hop on a plane and fly all the way across the country for a big meeting. They couldn't do that. They were on camels and horses, and they would have to not use these animals overly, because if they did, they'd kill the animals. So they had to take time to let them rest from time to time and be able to continue that journey. They could only cover so much a day. And so this was a great gathering, and it's going to take a lot of time for all of these officials to get to this place. When we look at verse 4, it says, Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages. And notice that, peoples, nations, languages, these all have been conquered, and he had all these people speaking all of these different languages. How did the heralds function in those times. It's kind of like our newspaper or the television that we have, or our iPads and tablets and things. That's how we get news today, isn't it? We function in that way. Well, the herald was the tablet of that time. He took the message that the king had under penalty that if he did not say exactly what the king told him to say, he's going to die. He's going to be punished severely up to death, depending on what the message was. And he went out into the streets, and he would walk the streets proclaiming in a loud voice the message of the king. There's their newspaper of the day, so to speak. It was an official position. He was a traveling newspaper, if you will. So what did the king command on this particular occasion? Well, look at verse 5. That at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, suckbach, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. So this herald would have been walking among this vast crowd. They didn't have microphones and speakers like we do today. He would have had to go walking through and signifying that when you hear all of this music, this noise really is what it was, when you hear all of this noise, which would carry far greater distance than his voice would, then here's what you do. They were to bow down, and they were to worship the image when they heard this, and you see I put it in quotation marks, quote, music, end quote, this so-called symphony began to play. It's interesting, the original word here is in the Greek is the word that we get our word symphony from. Kaufman made an observation which is interesting. He said, it's of very great interest in this passage is the prominence of instrumental music in the ceremonies of pagan religious rites. And I agree with him. It is of tremendous significance, especially when you get to the New Testament, but also of significance in the Old Testament as well. The God of heaven has never authorized instrumental music in worship to Him. Never. That's a bold statement, isn't it? In fact, people get pretty wired up when you say, well, instrumental music was never authorized by God, never commanded by Him, never approved by Him in worship. Especially our denominational friends, don't they? You mentioned to one of your friends sometime, would you know that God never authorized instrumental music in worship, never approved it? And watch the reaction you get. Often the religious world will immediately say, well, you know, instruments of music were used under the law of Moses in worship, and they are right, but God didn't approve it, nor did He command it. We're going to show you something about that. They then appeal to Amos chapter 6. Oh, see, instruments were used, and David used them. Let's say that we decided here, and understand, I'm just using William as an example, as the preacher, that Williams decided that, you know what, we need to use clickers, you know, noisy clickers, like we had when we were kids, and you just press that little piece of metal and it go click, 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 click as much as you pressed it. We need to use clickers to show that we approve of what's being said. Would that make it right? because he's the preacher? Or if we had elders, let's say William and Ron are the elders of this congregation, and they decided that, does that make it right? We know better than that, right? Well, just because David was a king and decided that something appealed to him or that he thought it would enhance the worship services and he decided to do it, does that make it right? Well, we know the answer to that, don't we? Let's look at Amos chapter 6 for just a moment. And notice what's said. What's the context all about of Amos chapter 6? It's a condemnation of a number of things that the Jews were doing at that time in their worship services as well as other activities. I'll give you time to read down through that list and just think about it. They are being condemned by the prophet Amos, who as a prophet was speaking God's word, exactly as God said it. And let's think about that just for a moment while you're reading. Is the God we serve powerful enough to use a human being, to use that human being's vocabulary and choose the words that are being said? Absolutely. That's inspiration. That's why when you read the books that Paul penned, the human author, being inspired by the Holy Spirit, wrote exactly what God said, but the words that he wrote, the style that he used, was different than the style that John used. Ron's going to get into all of that, aren't you, Ron? In the book God Breathed. Yeah. Condemning all of these activities. And notice verse 5. Look at verse 5, where David is particularly pointed out as being guilty. Notice through that whole list, it's just Jews in general who are pointed out until you get to verse 5, and David is specifically designated among all of the Jews who were doing all of these things. David's guilty, just like the Jews were designated as being guilty, verse 1 through verse 5. And notice that text began with, woe. Now that's not like we used to do. I can remember Granny's mule that she plowed with, and when he got down to the end of where she wanted to plow, to say, whoa! No, 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 no. Not the same. That's W-H-O-A, meaning stop. This is W-O-E. And that woe means you better stop, you better listen, you better pay attention, because what you're doing is not right, and there is punishment for disobedience. All of those concepts are involved in that word woe. Oh, and by the way, it does signify as well the idea of stop doing what you're doing. But notice what the text says. Woe, in the very beginning of this section, invent to themselves instruments of music like David. Did God approve of instruments being used? Where did David use these instruments? Now, David didn't invent an instrument. So what did he invent? Not the instruments themselves. We can go back in Genesis 4. We know who was the one who invented musical instruments. That was Jubal. No, David invented the use of instruments of music in worship. He's the one who's guilty of starting that practice. And the rest of the Jews were guilty because they allowed it to happen without a command from God or without God's approval. It's just that simple. If God wanted instruments of music to be used in worship to Him under the law of Moses, wouldn't He have said so? Wouldn't He have told them at Mount Sinai when He told them how they were to worship and what they were to do as far as building a tabernacle, the instruments that would be used in the worship, etc.? Yeah. Because He was very specific about all of those instruments, the table, the incense burners, all of that. Before David introduced them into worship, instrumental music was never used in authorized worship. I make no apologies for it. I'm not trying to be mean to anyone. I'm trying to help us understand. But it was used by the pagans. Now you start seeing a picture here. The pagans, those who worshiped idols, had been using instruments of music to cover up many things, especially when they offered a human sacrifice, when they offered to, I forgot the name now, Molech, whose statue was an iron statue with arms crossed in front of him, heated red hot, and they took their little baby up and laid it in his arms alive. They used the instruments of music to drown out the screams of pain and agony, the wailing of a mother. God has never allowed His people to copy that aspect of heathen worship. Look at verse 6. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. We've discussed before, I believe we have, if not, it bears repeating anyway. The hour was the very smallest measurement of time back in those times, even into the New Testament era. The hour was the smallest possible measurement. Otherwise, you had Paul saying, not for 1 second did we give in. Not 1 second to these false teachers. No, he used the term hour. The penalty for disobedience to Nebuchadnezzar's command is the same hour. As quickly as it can be done, they're going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. What we would call today a kiln. The hour was the smallest measurement of time, and it indicated a penalty was going to be enforced immediately, as quickly as it could be done. Now, if it's literally immediately, then that's going to cause us to ask some questions. Was this a furnace that had been heated to really hot beforehand because Nebuchadnezzar expected somebody to rebel against what he said? Again, we understand, we're speculating with these questions, but it's still questions that would be raised by the context. Was it a nearby furnace that was used daily for making the bricks or melting metals down? I don't know. King happened to think that the possibility was that this was a furnace that had been used to make the bricks for the base of the statue that had been put up, and then was turned around and used to melt the metal that the statue was made of. We don't know absolutely. Speculation. I understand that. Maybe it was a furnace that simply was being used ordinarily to punish men, because that seems to have been a common mode of punishing people for what was called serious crimes against the king or the state. Punishment by these means really does seem to have been a normal thing. Look at Jeremiah 29 and verse 22. And of them shall be taken up a curse by all the captivity of Judah, which are in Babylon, saying, watch this, the Lord make thee like Zedekiah and like Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire. Seems to have been a common method of punishment among many other things. One of the punishments that was often used by not the Babylonians, the Persians, was to take horses and tie a man's hand to the different horses, hands and his feet, and then whip the horses to go in all opposite directions. In other words, literally ripping the person apart. There were all kinds of horrible tortures that were done as punishment in those times. Notice the punishment that is prescribed by God for certain kinds of immorality. Don't look at this and say, oh man, that Nebuchadnezzar was cruel. Oh no. Are you going to make that same accusation against God? Better not. God did it because it was needed to enforce His rules and cause people to realize you don't break God's rules with punishment of this kind. Leviticus 20 verse 18. If a man take a wife and her mother, in other words, cohabits with them as husband and wife, it is wickedness. They shall be burnt with fire, both he and they, that there be no wickedness among you. Why did God use that punishment? To show that what was being done was horrible. Not the punishment, but the wickedness that caused the punishment. Look at Leviticus 21 and verse 9. And the daughter of any priest, notice this, if she profane herself by playing the whore, she profaneth her father, she shall be burnt with fire. God used fire. Is it possible that when the world knew God and refused to acknowledge Him anyway, had learned to use fire to punish certain activities from God? Oh, I'm not finished. How is eternal punishment described? Do you think if you had been the daughter of a priest that you'd think twice about becoming a prostitute if you knew that if you're caught, you're going to be burned with fire alive? I've been on fire. I was very lucky. But the flames were from my ankles all the way to my head, singed all the hair off my head. I was lucky I didn't do more damage to my skin. And I know how painful that was. And I'll be very honest with you, it's something that motivates me because I don't want to go to a place that's described as eternal fire. I don't want to go there. And you have probably had burns at some time or another, maybe sticking something in the oven and a little bitty burn. And how bad did it hurt? How bad did it hurt? Matthew 13, 41 through 42. The Son of Man, Jesus, shall send forth His angels, talking about the time of the end the end of time. Send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, sin, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, what are you going to do to those who disobey your... They're going to be thrown into a furnace of fire. God, what are you going to do? What kind of language did he use? Language that we humans can understand, even though we may not have any understanding at all of just how bad eternal hell is. A furnace of fire. Why was this demand of Nebuchadnezzar so important to him? It had to be of great importance to say, this is what I'm going to do to somebody who disobeys me, disobeys this command. Was it because he wanted them to worship his God? Was it because he wanted to be worshiped himself as a God? Did this statue represent him? Very possible. Was it a test of loyalty? Will they obey my commands or not? You know, treason has always been considered a act that is worthy of a death sentence. It has always been. Mankind from way back. If what was that guy that betrayed America, American soldier in the Revolutionary War when we broke away from England? Benedict Arnold. Why do you think he fled to England? Because he knew if they caught him after it was discovered that he was a traitor, he's going to be put to death. Let's think about that. Treason. Is it possible for a Christian to commit treason against the God of heaven? When we refuse to obey the commands of God, the commands of his kingdom, is that not treason? Look at verse 7. Therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. The instruments listed here cannot positively be identified. Some of them probably pretty close, but we don't know exactly what they were like. Now, archaeology has recently found some examples of harps. So we have a pretty good idea what their harps look like. And it's nothing like the big harp you see at a symphony where someone's sitting down in this great big monster thing and they're, plucking the strings. It's not like those. But some of them were rounded to a sense. Some of them were straight lines with like an L, and the strings were like this, and they'd hold them up against themselves. We found archaeological evidence both in paintings on walls, etc., and has shown us some of these instruments. Some of them were more what we might kind of call a guitar or something like that. Just a long piece of wood with the strings, and they'd play it that way. The importance of these is to indicate that a worship was about to begin and would be done literally while those instruments were still playing as the people bowed down to this image. And notice the text says, all the people fell down and worshiped the golden image. Note how the word all is used in this text and in many texts of the Bible. It's not used to signify everyone. It's used to signify that most of the people did. They bowed down. They engaged in worship. to an idol. And here comes some tattletales. Look at verse 8. Wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. Chaldeans. This is spoken of the wise men. Very possibly, as we noticed in our study before, they were the elite who were over all the different categories of these so-called wise men. In other words, the wisest of the wise. It's also believed that they were a particular group of people that were born in Babylon and were recognized by the term Chaldeans as being the elite. Why would they possibly want to see these 3 Hebrew boys killed? I think we know the answer to that. Look at Daniel 1 and verse 20. In all matters of wisdom and understanding. Remember, this was the test that had been done for those who were taken captive and trained in Babylonian manners and educated in all the best ways. In all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, the test, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians, astrologers, that all in his kingdom. You think maybe that might have caused some to be jealous? To have the king publicly proclaim these Jewish boys, young men really, these Jewish young men are 10 times better than all of my advisors. Think it might have caused resentment? They resented these foreigners. Why, we're Babylonians and we've had the best education and we're the higher class. And I think it might have caused resentment. I believe it was jealousy that triggered this desire to have these 3 boys. They finally found something that they thought they could get rid of these young men. Jealousy is a triggered desire really to have what somebody else has. We sometimes use the word envy to designate that kind of behavior. Why, you know, so-and-so has this big, beautiful car and it's the most expensive one in the world. And man, I want one of those. And if we allow jealousy and envy to take its place, what do we end up doing? If we allow it to take control, we steal one so we can have what they had. Or we try to find a way to take it away from them so that it's ours. Jealousy is always triggered by a selfish desire. A selfish desire that says, I deserve what you have and I deserve it more than you do. Consider something. What did they use against these 3 young men to try to get them killed? What did they use? Their religion. Think about that. I would suggest to you that that is still the case today. You can be jealous of truth and those who proclaim truth and those who do truth. A person can be jealous of that enough to want to destroy that person. And the world in which we live uses it all the time. Uses what? Our religion to attack us. In the first century, it was not uncommon for those who were the enemies of Christianity to accuse Christians of being cannibals because we partook of the Lord's Supper. Why, look at those cannibals. They eat the Lord's body. They drink His blood. That was their accusation. How silly it was. We don't literally, no matter what the Catholics say, when we partake of communion, literally partake of the Lord's body and drink His blood. We don't literally do that. It isn't somehow magically transformed when the wafer that they put on the person's tongue transformed into literal flesh. And look at the Chaldean slyness. They act like, well, we're defending your honor, Nebuchadnezzar. We're defending your majesty and your authority by pointing out these traitors, these rebellious people. And I want you to consider something else. When they used these three young men in their minds were a substitute for the entirety of all the Jews living in the kingdom. They don't obey your commands. They don't worship your gods. They use this to camouflage their pettiness, their jealousy, their ambition. And it's still being done today. I know Christians who have literally been fired from their secular jobs because they refuse to disobey God's laws in certain areas, whatever was asked of them to disobey. And that doesn't even begin to mention the preachers I know that have been fired because they had the audacity to preach against alcohol when the treasurer was making alcohol. Not you, John. Not you, Ron. Was making his homemade alcohol, and you can't have this. To talk about immorality in the family, when a family member of an elder, I could name names of preachers all over this brotherhood have been fired because they dared teach what God said. How sad. The word accused in this text is rather interesting. It comes from the word akal. And akal, NPR shows us that this Aramaic word means ate to pieces. They accused them. They ate to pieces. They're like cannibals, just devouring and tearing apart, like a wild animal, tearing apart the one that they want to destroy. But it's used in the Semitic languages as an idiom for slander. Accused. They slandered these Jewish people. It's character assassination, in other words. Slander is a common weapon that's often used when people are competing for power or prestige. Do we see that in this text? These are powerful people. But those that they're accusing, slandering, have more power than they do. More recognition by the king as being great, 10 times greater. We'll come back here next week and begin with verse 9 of our text. Hopefully the things that we've been discussing from Daniel can help us to see and help us even in our own time to realize the things that go on and the dangers that are faced. As Christians, we're going to face these dangers. They're constant. We are increasingly seeing in our own nation the authorities, police. I'll give you one example. Keith Mosier, a very good friend of mine, we're like brothers. We're like David and Jonathan. Keith was invited to speak on the Mall at D.C. against abortion. And he went there with a great group of people, had their permits in order, everything was legitimate. And one of the women officials, I forget, it was something to do with police, walked up to him and angrily said, "You are violating the law," and handcuffed him and walked away. Now, I will say this, it took a long time, but finally an official in the government issued a personal apology to Keith for that. But since that time, we have also have people in our own country who are in authority arresting or penalizing monetarily people for standing up for what's right. Look at what happened with the person who stood on Bible principle and refused to make a cake, a wedding cake, for two gay people. You know what happened. It's growing. And we may very well reach a time. How are we going to handle it? Daniel teaches us. And we'll get into more of that later in this book. Daniel shows us what we're to do, how we're to do it. We're going to see these young men, they showed respect in simply attending a state function ordered by the king. But then we're also going to notice that when he told them to do something that was wrong, they didn't do it. And that's what we're going to have to do. And that's what we have to do all through life. That employer that wants us to go out drinking with the staff, and we refuse. How you treated afterwards. You see the point. Daniel helps us. Daniel gives us courage to stand for what's right, even though it's going to cost us physically or mentally or financially. Daniel helps us and encourages us. And that's one of the things we need to draw from. The Old Testament indeed was written for our learning.